the ANC actually imposed a structural adjustment program on its own people through the economic policy of growth, employment, and distribution. Mandela, and behind closed doors in 1993, moved away from the explicit commitment in the Freedom Charter to socialism, to neoliberal capitalism, and when he stepped down as president, he said the one thing that's absolutely non-negotiable is the economic organization of our society through capitalism. But if that's not negotiable, what on earth does democracy mean, which is, of course, at the heart of Jean-Luc Nancy's argument that there is no democracy without something close to what he calls communism. That is to say, an effort such as this aims to bring into national dialogue questions about the insidious nature of racialized capitalism. Corporations were excluded from investigation during the events of Truth and Reconciliation Committee that granted amnesty to those who sought forgiveness for their crimes during apartheid. What is interesting about such a project, outside of its obvious merits of attempting to do justice, is that it seeks to mediate the brutality of apartheid, rendering it as a force that does not merely exist statistically in some reified history. Rather, the Commission argues, and of course we never got the Commission through Parliament, although we tried, that apartheid remains present in the lives of people today, such that any hope for a future society of justice must manifest it, and then this is again from our manifesto, drawing into a democratic discussion of economic reform all those on the ground groups who have worked tirelessly to develop programs of restitution and reparation, as well as consulting with economists who are exploring alternatives to capitalism. Ubuntu certainly played a foundational role in the activities of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and indeed, even in the final constitution, Ubuntu was used as a justification for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was, in the interim constitution, it was in the epilogue, as saying that Ubuntu was absolutely crucial from the transformation to a society of violence to a society of peace. And one way to understand that is that Ubuntu is very close to what Jen Balabar calls civility, in that it is an anti-violent ethic that converts violence into a form of institutions that themselves can embody an ethical relationship between people. Balabar uses the word civility, and the politics must now include civility, so it's emancipation, transformation, and civility. I'm arguing here very strongly that there's a deep sense in which Ubuntu does practice exactly that function of converting violence in an anti-violent ethic into an institutional structure that can embody, even though of course it has to always be transformed, into a difference symbolically and materially from the past. One classic example in South Africa of how the legacy of apartheid yields a difficult situation for the thinking of new humanism can be found in the conflict between the right of private property and the right to provide adequate housing. Clearly, the conflict between these two rights is not simply a legal matter, but is deeply embedded in the horrific inequalities that are the inevitable result of more than 350 years of racialized capitalism. Ubuntu has played an important role as both a legal and an ethical principle for thinking about what this conflict means in terms of innovative legal solutions towards the enactment of justice. In a path-breaking case, Justice Avi Sachs used Ubuntu to argue that there could be no doing of justice in a situation where there was a demand for eviction, unless a process of mediation had taken place between the parties involved. Nor can mediation simply operate as a strategic or cost-saving device. Mediation in a profound sense is a demand for doing justice in specific circumstances. In one sense, all eviction cases seem to be alike in that squatters are on private property illegally. For Sachs, the obligation imposed upon the judiciary is not to try to establish some formalistic hierarchical relationship between the different interests involved, or giving rules for how such a hierarchy would be imposed, given the two competing rights. Indeed, obligation involves evaluating all the circumstances that surround a particular eviction. For example, Sachs instructs us to consider how long the squatters have been on the land, how much community they have formed, how the city has developed or not a meaningful alternative shelter. To be clear, these simple factors to be considered must be weighed judicially with respect to their specific circumstances and, more importantly for Sachs, in the ethical practice of Ubuntu. To quote Sachs, the obligation on the court is to have regard to circumstances, that is, to give them due weight in making its judgment as to what is just and equitable. The court cannot fulfill its responsibility in this respect if it does not have the requisite information at its disposal. It needs to be fully appraised of the circumstances before it can have regard to them. It follows that although it's incumbent on the interested parties to make all relevant information available, technical questions relating to the onus of proof should not play an unduly significant role in its inquiry. The court is not resolving a civil dispute as to who has rights under land law. The existence of unlawfulness is the foundation for the inquiry, not its subject matter. Some sentence that would give many law professors a heart attack. For Sachs, mediation becomes a crucial part of how contending parties come to grapple with conflict in which they find themselves, not as rights-bearing individuals, but as people who must live together in a community and must find a just way to resolve the conflict. Here we have a classic example of Ubuntu as a demand to do justice in a way that respects all parties involved in a conflict as capable of finding an ethical resolution together. This is why there can be no formalistic, legalistic resolution, because each case is going to provide us with a unique set of factors that must be considered by the parties themselves in resolving conflict. Roger Berkowitz, in a path-breaking book called The Gift of Science, argues that the doing of justice as a notion of law has been replaced primarily in modern legal systems with the giving of law. But under Ubuntu, Ubuntu is a demand to do justice. So therefore, for example, you would have no rule of what is the sentence for someone who steals a car, because a 16-year-old boy who steals a car under certain conditions is very different than a 50-year-old man who steals a car who's associated with the mafia. So to try to have a rule that says both stole a car would make absolutely no sense. What you have to do is to think through what the doing of justice would mean in that particular circumstances. So in this sense, Ubuntu retains the idea that it's not the giving of law that matters, it's law as a doing of justice that is central. We should note that anything like a sustainable reconciliation for both parties in this kind of conflicting situation is only possible through direct participatory democracy in which everyone must have a voice and everyone must be heard. Again, returning to the definition of Ubuntu provided by McGogle Moore, we see that Ubuntu is an ethical and ideological concept with political implications. Such is the case because participatory democracy is organic to communities in conflict, and it's the actual voices of human beings involved in the conflict that must be heard in order to enable a genuine reconciliation of the parties in which both sides come to accept a resolution as a doing of justice for the purposes of conflict. In like manner, the shack dwellers movement began in Durban, which has spread through South Africa, powerfully argued, using Ubuntu, that the struggle for housing, education, and basic resources integral to life itself become part of a larger struggle for a people's communism. These struggles are explicitly defined as fighting against the dispossession of resources. Dispossession can only make sense if one assumes that basic resources such as water should be in the hands of all people and not be privatized. Only then would it make sense to say that the privatization of electricity is a form of dispossession. What is important for our purposes in these struggles is that Ubuntu is used to define an ethic of living communism in which people come together as co-producers of alternative ways of sharing resources, and indeed as co-producers of a different way of living together by developing a life in common. Living communism for the shack dwellers movement involves a struggle to live together in Ubuntu